And vitamin D manufactured by the skin gets deposited in the bones. Right? And today, 40 minutes later, we're going to start talking about the skeletal system. Okay? Everybody get the password? Because this thing does not work. And now we are videoing, so saying the password now would be a bad idea. So if you didn't get the password, come see me after class. Alright, bear with me, I'm almost there. Got a little ground to make up from this. We'll be good. So, the skin and the bones relate because the skin actually helps the bones with respect to their health. And that's a critical piece that we're going to look at today. We're going to look at why it's important because we're going to look at the functionality of the skeletal system. Right? We're going to look at what makes up the skeletal system first. Things like bones, cartilage, and ligaments. Ligaments help to support the bony architecture. If we look at what the functionality of the skeletal system is, this is a similar question that we were starting out the lecture with as we're trying to troubleshoot some of the technical difficulties, but now we're back and we're on a roll. If we look at multiple functions of the skeletal system, we can consider it an organ system as well. Why, by definition, would you consider it an organ system? Why is it considered an organ system? There's more than one tissue that work together to do what? Perform a function or multiple functions. So we have multiple functions that are listed here. What do the bones do for me? That's a way of saying, here's the function of bone. So on the exam, I might ask the question, which of the following are functions of the skeletal system? Vitamin D synthesis. True or false? False. What system is it a function of? The integument, or the skin. Support allows us to walk on two legs. Protection, if you think of the rib cage, it protects our vital organs. Movement, locomotion is another name for movement. So you may not see movement on the exam, you might see the word locomotion. Locomotion is a terminology that you would have gotten from a prerequisite class. Right? How organisms actually move around we consider locomotion. We are an organism, we call it movement. Electrolyte balance. Right? Electrolyte balance is the bones themselves help to store certain types of electrolytes and release them. For example, calcium and phosphate ions are stored in the bony architecture, and then when the body demands them, they're released into the bloodstream to maintain a homeostatic environment of electrolytes. Acid-base balance. The bone tissue helps to buffer the blood. Remember we talked about the pH of blood. What was the range of pH of blood? About 7.35 to 7.45. It's pretty tightly controlled. And the bone itself helps to maintain that acid-base balance by creating a buffer, a bicarbonate buffer that can be available when it's needed. Lastly, blood formation. We'll look at that today. We'll look at every single one of these. Blood formation. So the bone itself is an organ, and it has tissue within it that's hematopoietic. Hematopoietic means it manufactures new blood cells. So when I was at a conference, and I missed you guys, I was helping moderate a session. It was a debate session. And the debate session topic was tissue-engineered products versus classic medical devices. What's the future? And one debater, debater one, had the pro-medical device side of the argument, and the other debater had the pro-tissue engineering side of the argument. And I was sitting at lunch with both of them at different times, and I was trying to coach them, right? And I wanted to coach them well so that they really were, angry with each other and, put on a good show. I mean, it's better if they're really close to punching each other out. So one of the arguments that I set up for our debater who was pro-tissue engineering was this concept of there is no medical device, which would be synthetic, okay, but it's not alive, it's not based of cells, it's not based of tissues, that's been able to replace the functionality of orthopedics and bone replacement where you can create new blood cells. You can make titanium rods and screws and cages. You can be super sophisticated as an engineer and build a complete replica of the bony architecture. And you could make it lighter. Sure, fine. Find some titanium alloy that's lighter than bone. But I guarantee you, you will never allow it to regenerate new cells unless it has cells in it. Remember, that's the cell theory. So we've been doing bone marrow transplants for about 4 decades, successfully. Right? And we have not yet been able to figure out how to replace with all... We can send an astronaut and put him on Mars, most likely, in the future. But we still have not been able to figure out how to replace the bone functionality of replacing blood. Okay? So if we look at classifications, and you saw this in lab. If you look at the different classifications, now these are somewhat arbitrary. And what I mean by that is if you're talking to your lab instructor, now the lab manual that you're using is one that I had a lot to do with. So the instructor may decide to deviate from the lab manual. But if you're going by the lab manual, you'll have these same classifications. But if you use a different lab manual, or if you're an instructor in lab, or if you were at a different institution in the past, or you pick up a different textbook, you may see slightly different categories. For example, you may not see irregular and sesamoid in 5 classifications. You may only see 4. But long bones are longer than they are wide. Right? We can see some examples of long bones are the femur, which is the thigh bone, as well as the ulna and the radius, which are the lower arm bones. Short bones are about equal in length and width. Flat bones are obviously flat, and some examples there would be the scapula, the sternum, and bones of the skull. The irregular bones, these are ones that have an unusual shape. And so you would see the vertebrae as well as the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone in the skull is basically like a vertebrae of the cranial space. Right? It actually spans the entire architecture of the cranial cap. It's kind of like going up in your attic, and you see the truss system. That's sort of what the sphenoid does in the inside of the cranial cap. Those would be irregular bones. Sesamoid bones, they usually develop between ligaments or muscles, and so the best example would be the patella, or the kneecap. In some textbooks, they don't use the word sesamoid, they just call it irregular. So they don't have this classification, they just put it in irregular. For purposes of our exam, I want you to know the 5.
Could you repeat what is the sesamoid?
Sesamoid is the kneecap, or the patella.
It forms in between bones?
It forms in between ligaments or muscles.
Thank you.
Okay? If we look at classifying it by location, you already went over in lab the different architecture, meaning the axial and the appendicular skeleton. The axial is this long axis of the body, includes the skull, the vertebral column, and the ribs. So it's going to be everything that is in white on this slide. The appendicular are like appendages. So the appendages are the extremity, and they would be everything that's in green on this particular slide. Okay, so that's all review, pretty boring stuff, but now we're going to start getting into a little bit more of the tissue, and we're going to go beyond really what you cover in lab here very quickly. We're going to get into the physiology. Well, if we look more micro-architecturally, we have different types of bone tissue itself. we have what we call cancellous bone, and it has two additional names. And it's important you write these down. Because depending upon what textbook you're reading, or where you're looking up on the internet, you're going to get different terminology, and you're going to be quickly confused. Because nobody seems to use the exact same terminology. It's like driving in Flagstaff, and you're, where are you? I'm going on Huntington. You mean industrial? No, I mean Huntington. Oh, industrial. No, Huntington. Some of you guys don't even know what I'm talking about. There are roads that turn into other roads. It's the same road, you're going straight, and you're like, I never turned, I'm on a different street, okay? Thank goodness for Siri, right, and cell phones. But cancellous bone, another name is trabecular bone, or spongy bone. Now it gets its name because it really has an appearance that looks like sponge. You can see that right here. You can kind of appreciate this spongy bone appearance. If you blew that up in larger view, and we'll see pictures of that in the subsequent lectures, you'll see an architecture that looks like a porous sponge. Like a sponge you would see in the ocean. Or even a synthetic one you'd scrub your sink with. A quarter of all the bone, 25% of all the bone in the body is spongy bone by makeup. You find it at the end of long bones, in the middle of many of the other bones. This terminology known as diploe is a Greek term that means twofold. Diploe is an organization of spongy bone where it operates structurally like a sandwich. So inside the middle, you have the spongy part, and then on either side of the spongy bone, you're going to have compact bone, which is going to be kind of like the pieces of bread, if you will. So it's almost like cutting through a bike helmet. You have a hard outer covering, you'd have sort of like a soft, spongy material in the middle, and then you'd have probably some other solid structure on the bottom, and then you'd have felt that goes and touches your head. So diploe means twofold, meaning it has kind of two sides to it. And spongy bone doesn't really exist outside of this architecture. It always has sort of a top and a bottom capping it, if you will, bookending it. Osseous tissue is the other type of bone. And I just mentioned compact bone. So osseous has two other names. Another name is compact bone. Another name after that would be cortical bone. So osseous, cortical, or compact bone are basically solid bone without any pores really in it. Okay? And that's what you're seeing right here. This is sort of this non-porous bone structure that this bone is sitting within. And you can see right on the surface here as well, there is a sheet, and it's even labeled, of compact bone that sits on top of and caps the spongy bone. So that's how bone is organized within the body. The compact, cortical, otherwise known as osseous bone, has a medullary cavity inside of it. So it has a hollowed out structure that we're going to talk more about in our subsequent lectures. And that hollowed out structure not only keeps the bones lighter, it actually makes them stronger. And some of you are going to have trouble understanding or appreciating this, but we will talk about how hollowing out the inside of the bone and pushing the mass of the bone to the extremities actually increases the strength or the resistance to bending of the bone. It also creates a hollow cavity where it makes it a little bit more light. And it also, what it does, is create a spot where you can pack cellular material. You can put bone marrow, which is where your regenerative cells lie to give you new red and white blood cells. So if we continue on this theme of these bone features and we look at a long bone, remember it's longer than it is wide, we can quickly appreciate these architectural features. So this is a living bone on the left, and this is a dried out or dead bone like the ones that you find in the lab. And on the living side, you can appreciate right here, here is a blood vessel coming in the nutrient foramina and dives into the bone itself and provides it with a network of blood flow. So if you snap a bone or break a bone, or if you cut a bone in surgery, it bleeds incredibly well. Okay? So if you've ever broken a bone, a lot of times you'll see a hematoma that forms around where that break is because there's blood that's escaping out of the bone. Well, this is that nutrient foramina. or foramen right here. If you go over to the dried out bone, you can kind of see the parallel structures. The epiphysis is the end, so you have a proximal and a distal epiphysis, and then you have a middle segment which is known as the diaphysis, or the shaft. And then right at the border between the diaphysis and the epiphysis is this epiphyseal line, okay, or this growth line. It later closes up from a plate to form the line. Early in childhood, it's all plate, and there's turnover of cartilage into bone, and that's what elongates the bone, and that's where the growth comes from. So after puberty is done and after the growth spurt is over, usually in the late teens or early 20s, on average, plus or minus, most of you are probably done growing. Some of you might grow a little bit more. But what's happening is this epiphyseal plate is ossifying. It's hardening. And it goes from a cartilage plate to a bony plate, and that's what creates this line or this scar. You can actually see it. I'll show you images, radiographs of this plate going to a line in future lectures. But this is truly where most of the growth takes place in humans during puberty, is the legs get longer and the arms get longer. Now we have some disorders that we'll talk about in the later lectures, like achondroplastic dwarfism. These are individuals that have very short, childlike length arms and legs, but their head and their torso are adult-sized. Okay, and so the proportions look a little different and off because they don't have a lot of growth happening at that epiphyseal plate. So we'll talk about what's happening there in the future. So the periosteum is this outer fibrous collagen layer. The periosteum has within it an inner osteogenic layer, and it houses or allows for that nutrient foramina to exist. That's in the periosteum, this outer covering. Peri, think like perimeter, so you know it's the outer covering. In contrast to the periosteum is the endosteum, which is inside, endo meaning inside. So the periosteum is on the outside covering, the endosteum is on the inner lining that's touching the bone marrow. The endosteum is made up of reticular connective tissue. It has a tremendous amount of osteoclastic and osteoblastic activity. We'll talk about those two cell types, but does anybody have any prior knowledge as to what cell does what? Yes, with the pencil up in the air. Osteoblast build bone, very good.
And osteoclast, not crushed bone, but like
They break it down. They break down existing bone. And so osteoclast, breakdown bone, osteoblast, build bone. And what a lot of people don't understand is that happens like right now. Your osteoblasts and your osteoclasts are operational right now. They never stop building bone or breaking down bone. They're always moving. So bone is a living tissue that is always changing. It's always remodeling. So that's the other thing that's kind of crazy to think about when you replace bone with titanium implants. I guarantee you that titanium doesn't change. Not much. But bone turns over pretty aggressively. Okay? We'll talk about some of those data a little bit later. The epiphyseal plate, we talked about that. That's the point of elongation. The cartilage model when you're a young child is hyaline cartilage, and it turns over, and as it turns over, it becomes bone, and it ossifies, and the cartilage cell is replaced with an osteocyte, or a bone cell, and that actually elongates in both directions. And then once the plate closes, it becomes the epiphyseal line. Okay, so let's talk more about these cell types that are here. Let's talk about a review slide. This review slide is what makes up connective tissue. The CT stands for connective tissue. Well, don't you remember that it is a combination of matrix as well as cells, right? And TV monitors. So if it's matrix and cells, and another word for a cell would be a blast or a site. Okay? And it's made up of cells in matrix, then it would be a type of tissue that we've described in the past. Now, connective tissue, right, unlike epithelial tissue, the connective tissue is what proportion cells versus matrix? More matrix or more cells? More what? More matrix. Very good. And which type of tissue is more cell-rich and matrix-poor? Epithelial tissue. Okay, this is a cumulative exam coming up. That's why I'm going over some of these review concepts, because you may see some of them come back. Okay? So if we look at the way bone is set up, this is a slide that you might have in the lab. You have it on the DVD if you have the DVD. And this is a cross-section. So it's taking a piece of bone and cutting it and looking at it down and on. And the example that I like to use is if you get a group of pencils, okay, or you can do it with markers or crayons. And let's pretend that this stack is like my tibia, okay, or my femur. And if I cut out a piece and I did a cross-sectional view, and then you were looking at end on, right, you're actually seeing those circles. And they're columns. And that's what you're looking at here from the top view, is you're looking at columns. Columns of this Haversian system. And so that's one sort of pencil or marker that you're looking at from the top. And so that column runs longwise or lengthwise. So we've got this very unique architecture, and as you build bone and you actually increase the diameter of the bone, you add one more column, and then another column, and then another column. And if you remember, down the middle, what is the middle of the column called? That's the what? The central canal. And that provides nutrition to those cells, right, within that particular matrix environment. So if bone is a connective tissue, then if we looked at the cell component and the matrix component, we should actually see some things that are familiar. So we're going to see different features with respect to cell composition, like what we saw in skin. We talked about different cells that were in skin. We talked about fibroblasts, and we talked about keratinocytes, and we talked about melanocytes. And all of those cells did different things in skin, remember? Just to review, what do melanocytes do? They produce melanin. And melanin does what?
Protects.
It's a UV protector. It's your natural sunscreen. And fibroblasts do what? What do they do? I don't know. That's a good question. What's that? They create the extracellular matrix environment and produce the protein matrix that the cells live in. That's what fibroblasts do. And keratinocytes? They make what? Keratin. Right? What does keratin do? Strength and waterproofing, right? Okay, so are you seeing a theme here? We're going to get to every tissue and you're going to see things about the cells and things about the matrix that are unique. So here we've got cells. We don't see fibroblasts. We don't see keratinocytes. We see osteogenic cells, osteoblasts, and osteocytes. Osteogenic cells are found in both the endosteum and the periosteum. They're the ones that give rise to new cells. The osteoblasts come from osteogenic cells. These guys are non-mitotic, so they no longer divide. They just come from their precursor cell. You find these guys hanging out both in the endosteum and the periosteum. They secrete collagen. So the osteoblast has a function kind of like a fibroblast. Fibroblast, osteoblast. Make sense? So the osteoblast makes collagen, and it gets encrusted with a hydroxyapatite. Hydroxyapatite is bone mineral. It's a calcium phosphate that gives bone some of its hardness. So that's the osteoblast's role. And then as the osteoblast matures, it becomes a resident osteocyte. Osteo meaning bone, cyte meaning cell. So this word literally translates to bone cell. So you don't see a fibroblast, you see a osteoblast, which is the bone's equivalent of the fibroblast in the skin. Make sense? Now if we move on, we see a third cell type, osteocyte, where I just talked about. This is trapped within the matrix, and as it gets trapped in the matrix, it resides, it stays permanently. And it's surrounded by the matrix that the osteoblast had made. And so if you look at the scanning electron micrograph, and you blow up this little box, that's this structure right here. This is the osteocyte. That's the cartoon representation of this guy right here. And all of these little channels connect one osteocyte to its neighboring osteocyte. And each osteocyte connects to each osteocyte, which eventually connects to the central canal. And those cannuliculi are these little tube-like channels that look like these spider-like projections that connect one osteocyte to another, that allows nutrition to flow to the cell and allows waste products to be removed. So it's kind of like the osteocyte gets so big it just actually decides to stay on the couch, and it has meals brought to it, and then its waste is removed. Okay, so that's what this structure looks like. Now, the last cell type, the fourth cell type, doesn't come from this same lineage. So you can see this lineage, osteogenic, osteoblast, to an osteocyte. So those are our three cells that have a similar lineage, a family tree that one makes the other, which makes the next one. This one comes from a totally different source. It comes from the bone marrow, and it comes from stem cells within the bone marrow that are fused. These stem cells go through this cellular fusion, and they end up with a multinucleated cell. So one of the big differences between an osteogenic, an osteoblast, and an osteocyte, and an osteoclast, these guys all have a single nucleus. This guy actually is multinucleated because of the number of cells that have fused. As the numbers of cells fuse, they're actually slightly larger. In fact, you can see here is an osteoclast, this relative size, compared to a resident osteocyte. You see that? So this is, 10 times larger than an osteocyte? And the other feature is these guys have this sort of ruffled border. It looks like this mohawk or a comb on one side. It's actually on the leading edge. These guys actually secrete acid. Seriously, they release acid. Hydrochloric acid. That helps to digest the minerals. And they also release acid phosphatase, which digests the collagen. So this is like a really ridiculous murder mystery. They're getting rid of the body inside of you by just digesting it. Right? They're digesting bone with acid phosphatase and hydrochloric acid. So the way they do this is they secrete it on this ruffled border side right here. The lysosomes fuse with the membrane, and they dump out these materials, these chemicals, and that actually breaks the bone down only on this leading edge side. So it forms this resorption bay, which is like this little indention. You can this one's going from left to right, this one's going from right to left. Does that make sense? So this picture is going from this direction to this direction. This picture is going from the opposite, to the right to the left. And so the resorption bay is on the left side here, and the resorption bay is on the right side there. Because that's where it's chewing away the bone. Question?
Why is the bone broken down?
We'll get there. But why is the bone broken down? Well, if you need calcium available in the bloodstream, where's your fastest source of calcium coming from? Bone. So you just break down a little bit of bone, you release all this calcium. How do you get it into the bloodstream quickly? Is it a vascularized tissue? It's incredibly vascularized, right? So around every osteocyte are these cannuliculi that connect to the central canal, which ultimately connects out to the nutrient foramina, and it goes to the vascular supply. Your blood cells come from the bone marrow, are manufactured there and released into the bloodstream. So it's a very efficient silo of calcium. That's why. So when you need calcium, you resorb bone a little bit to release the calcium. When you don't need the calcium, you have excess calcium floating around your bloodstream, what do you stimulate? Not osteoclast, you stimulate what? Osteoblast. You lay down new bone matrix. And that sequesters and takes the calcium out of the bloodstream so you don't urinate and lose that priceless commodity. Okay? So it's constantly turning over right now as your osteoclasts and osteoblasts are breaking down and building bone in different parts of the body. And we'll talk about this later, but it's based upon the force that your bone is placed under. So if your bone is placed under lots of force due to load-bearing activity, you're going to favor osteoblastic activity. All right? If your bones are not loaded, like you're bedridden, or you're casted for like 8 weeks because of a broken limb, you're going to have significant loss of bone. And muscle, you'll see atrophy of the muscle, but you're going to have bone density that goes down. So osteoclasts chew this bone up to recycle it. It doesn't chew it up to get rid of it, it chews it up to shape the bone or to carve the bone out, to change where the force vectors come through that bone. It constantly adapts to the environment that it's seeing. It is a living tissue. And it's very specialized in its ability. All right, so those are the 4 types of bone. If we look bone cells, if we look now away from the cells and we look at the matrix, we look at what the matrix has to offer, we see that it's, interestingly, not 100% organic. Right? Back to our original sort of soapbox presentation of which is better, the debate. I like these debates, right? Which is better, remember this? We set this up at one of our first classes together. Was which is more important, organic or inorganic? They're both critically important. So that theme continues right here. Someone might argue, well, maybe the inorganic is more important because it's 2/3 inorganic and it's only 1/3 organic. Okay, fine. Okay, you might have us for now. But 1/3 organic by weight. The organic material are things like collagen, which is a protein. If you look back at your notes, collagen, proteins, lipids, sugars, right? Nucleotides, they were all organic compounds. So this totally makes sense. Collagen is a protein, it's organic. A glycoprotein is a sugar-coated protein, that's organic. Proteoglycan is also a different type of sugar-coated protein, also organic. These guys function in the bone to resist bending and tension. Now the inorganic component is 85% hydroxyapatite. That's that calcium phosphate, that bone mineral that we were talking about. And this resists compression. So between the inorganic and the organic component of bone, you're getting 2 completely different mechanical properties infused into one structure. So the analogy would be if you're manufacturing different types of ceramics or steel, okay, metals or ceramics, or even plastics. You may not use 100% of one ingredient because you want some of this and you want some of that to give you a blend. Most of you are riding bicycles that is some sort of metal alloy. It's not pure anything. Because you want some sort of either flexibility and strength, right? Or you want less flexibility and more rigid, depending upon what the strategy is for that manufacturer of that bike frame. That's the exact same thing that's happening biologically here. Is you're putting into the bone components that give it unique features. Okay? Now, if we look at the architecture of the osseous tissue, we go back to this picture that I showed earlier, and then here's a cartoon drawing of this, sort of pattern of these markers. This is the column that we're looking at, one marker. We're going to see organization in columns like this in 3 main sections in this class. We're going to see this architecture in columns, this motif, this blueprint, first in bone. We're going to see it again in nerve fiber orientation. And we're also going to see it a 3rd time with muscle fiber architecture. The architecture or the structure, the way that it's organized with these columns is found in 3 different types of organ systems in the body. Do you think it's probably important? It wouldn't be designed that way if it wasn't critical, right? Or it wouldn't have selected for that type of pattern if it wasn't something that was important. So we have these lamellae, or these lamellar rings, that actually surround each of the central canals. The central canal was originally called the Canal of Havers, and this was actually by a British physician, Clopton Havers. So we're moving away from names of people, and we're moving more towards just like central canal, instead of the Haversian Canal, or the Canal of Havers. So if you look at some of the old medical textbooks, you'll see some of these kind of funky names, and they're either German or British or Dutch names. These are the original people that discovered these structures. There's a sphincter called the sphincter of Oddi. I mean, how would you have been, hey Mom, guess what? I named a sphincter today. Aren't you so proud? So we don't have that awkward call Mom anymore. We just, call it, the critical sphincter or something, something new. So the osteon, now the perforating canals, these perforating canals used to be called Volkmann canals. So that's another terminology of Volkmann canals. And they actually go from one osteon to another. So the cannuliculi go from one lamella to another, or one osteocyte to another. And the Volkmann canals go from a central canal to a central canal. Or perforating. They go sideways, like from the green to the black marker. There's actually a canal that goes sideways or perforates from one to the other. Okay? So this is our architectural strategy as we move through bone. Now, if we look at other features of bone, we see that this is cancellous bone, and I want to show you this histology slide because it's actually a little bit important. It has these structures known as trabeculae. So the trabeculae are these sort of struts of bone. So this red with this black streaks across it are kind of like struts on a bridge, if you look at a bridge. In between the spaces of hard bone, cancellous bone, you have open pockets, and it's filled with something. That's this whitish, purplish mass, and that's the bone marrow. And you can see there's bone marrow running throughout all of this open architecture. So the trabeculae, they're going to develop along these orientations of stress. So what's cool about this is, so I have a brother who's a civil engineer. He likes designing bridges. And, before they ever build the bridge, it's like, they calculate so many times, right? They're using calculators, numbers, and all these things, right? And then they double check, and they have the safety factors. Then they finally decide to build it. But they don't truly know until people drive on it, if it actually was designed correctly. Or the first earthquake or storm or whatever, okay? And there's a famous bridge up in the Pacific Northwest, and you probably saw a video of it with it shaking, right, during wind, and it was engineered incorrectly. Well, imagine if, it's kind of like transformer technology, right? But imagine if the bridge had the ability to remodel as it was experiencing new stresses. Right? And it's like those transformer movies, right? We've never seen anything like that. That's what bone does. Is bone will go through every stage of your life modifying its architecture based upon what you're doing. So training, if you're into a heavy training program competitively right now, your bone is remodeling to make you more advantageous in that particular fitness. Okay? It's strengthening. Let's say it's a lot of legs, okay? A lot of burst of sprint type of activities in your lower extremities. The muscle mass as it grows needs an architecture to hold on to. So the bone itself is going to enlarge and the density is going to go up. It may actually lower your bone density in your upper extremities if you're not using it for that particular activity. So you will remodel based upon the stresses placed on you. So the trabeculae, they reorient based upon where they're needed. And that's why that's one of the reasons you need osteoclasts, is if this trabeculae is no longer necessary and you say, you know what, I really should have built it over here, then you start building it over here and you dissolve this one. And that's what the osteoclast can do for us. Now we'll see in our third lecture, this is also the Achilles heel. Because these osteoclasts have the ability to get out of whack. They have the ability to have overproduction of hydrochloric acid or be stimulated to a greater extent than osteoblasts. And that is a disease situation. We see that with a disease you've probably heard of. What is it? Osteoporosis. So we will get there. But until you understand the fundamentals, you can't go, starting to treat patients with osteoporosis until you understand why. So osteoporosis, if you're going to be a physician, a physical therapist, or a nurse, you're going to be dealing with an elderly population. Men and women are susceptible and do get osteoporosis. Now, more women than men, but there are men that have osteoporosis. And the age of our population is getting older, and you all are probably going to be dealing with these types of patients. So it's really important that you understand what are the cells that are responsible for forming bone and remodeling it, so you can explain it to your patients what's happening. Why it's important for you to go for a walk. Why it's important for you to eat certain foods. We'll talk about some of those things. So we take advantage of the empty space, because you never see a bridge across a structure. Even our mechanical or our structural or our civil engineers never build like a giant solid tube across a span. It's open so that things can flow through. It's lighter. We use that same strategy in biology, and those open spaces now we pack with something functional, and that's bone marrow. So there's some tremendous advantage of osseous tissue. Now, the bone marrow itself, we have different types of bone marrow, but this is really soft tissue that's between the trabeculae, and it's found also in our medullary cavities, okay, our medullary spaces. And if we look at red bone marrow first, red bone marrow is what we call hematopoietic tissue, and that's a fancy word, but you'll probably see it on the exam. Hematopoietic tissue means that it makes new blood cells. Hemo coming from the blood. So red bone marrow is classically found in children in all medullary spaces. Anywhere you have an open space in children, you pack it full of red marrow. It should make sense when you think about the function of the marrow. Well, if an organism is growing and new tissue is being added, what are the oxygenation demands? High or low? High. So the turnover rate of red blood cells, high or low? It's very high. You're needing, more and more of them as, like every couple of years the kid doubles in size, it seems like, right? At least that's what it seems like when you look at the genes that they don't fit into anymore. So as they're growing, they're adding more tissue, and there's more blood that needs to be manufactured to keep up with that tissue. It's not just socks, shoes, and jeans, right? You need tissue, and it has to be vascularized. So in children, it's everywhere. After we're done growing, we just maintain. So you shut off a lot of that medullary space in adults. So in adults, you only find it in the pectoral and the pelvic girdle, so that's the shoulder, and in the hip region, okay, pectoral and pelvic girdles, the skull itself, and the proximal ends of the femur and the humerus. So the femur would be the thigh bone, the upper leg bone, so the proximal head, and then the proximal head of the humerus or in the shoulder. So it kind of changes as we get older. Now, the red bone marrow actually is responsible for manufacturing red blood cells, white blood cells, as well as platelets. Okay, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Now we have a second type of bone marrow. It's called yellow bone marrow. Yellow bone marrow is mostly fat cells, mostly adipocytes. It replaces the red bone marrow as we get older. So where it was red bone marrow as a child, now it's replaced with yellow bone marrow. If necessary, it can revert back to red bone marrow and become hematopoietic. You're saying, well, if necessary, what does that mean? Well, in an emergency situation, let's say your body's under an extreme viral attack, or let's pretend that maybe you have mono, for example, as that virus, or you're ill on a regular basis, then you may actually harness some of your reserves and your yellow becomes back to red so that you can actually replenish. As we get older, it becomes more gelatinous yellow bone marrow. So not really a third type. It's just yellow bone marrow that is, once it's gelatinous, it's no longer reversible back to red. Okay? So the old age, the yellow marrow kind of becomes more gelatinous in architecture. Now, gelatinous bone marrow has also been found not only in our elderly patients, but also in patients that suffer from anorexia, from malabsorption of nutrition, various types of disorders like Crohn's disease and etc., as well as patients that suffer with HIV or AIDS. Now, what I want you to do right now is this activity. I want you to discuss what would happen to a patient whose bone marrow became compromised from disease. Right now. What would happen? Talk about what would be the implication. Okay, let's hear some ideas. So there's a disease, a hypothetical disease, but let's say it's cancer. It targets and affects the bone marrow. So what would happen? What are some ideas?
No new blood cells.
No new blood cells, or a compromised ability to manufacture replacement blood cells. What else? Yes?
You wouldn't be able to fight off infection.
You'd have a compromised ability to fight off infection. I would agree. That would be mostly the white blood cells that you wouldn't be manufacturing. This gentleman said no new blood cells. So you would have no new white blood cells. You couldn't fight off infection. And the red blood cells, if you didn't have them, what would happen there? Do you have something different, or do you want to answer that question? Okay, go for it.
You'd have less blood platelets, so that means that maybe would be more confused.
You'd have fewer blood platelets, so you might have coagulation problems in the very back.
If it's in a kid, would it affect their ability to grow?
It could affect their ability to grow, because back to my question about if you didn't have the red blood cells or the white blood cells, infection would be compromised, or the ability to fight off infection would be compromised. The ability to transport oxygen, what would happen there? It would be compromised because you wouldn't be making red blood cells. And so then you may not have growth spurts taking place appropriately. Right? The patient actually may have, shortness of breath. They may be more pale in color. Poor oxygenation. They may have symptoms that resemble anemia. Right? Okay. Just a question to get you thinking about, if you know what it does, if you take it away, what's the result? Okay? So now, in the last time that we have here, in the last 10 minutes, I want to talk about two mechanisms of how bone develops. We've talked about what bone is. We've kind of segued and connected it to the skin. And what you're going to see this semester, guys, is the way I organize the class is actually very purposeful. In fact, it seems like it's following the textbook, but every now and then it won't. Like, for example, I will lecture on the nervous system before I lecture on the muscles. And most A&P textbooks put it the other way around. And I don't think that's the right way to do it, because you can't get muscle contraction unless you have a nerve stimulus. So we talk about nerve stimulus first, then we talk about muscle contraction. So this unit is, maybe it seems arbitrary, but the skin and the bones are actually linked together. The skin and the bones are linked together because the skin generates vitamin D, and vitamin D is critically important for calcium absorption. And calcium is absolutely critical for the formation of the bony architecture. Okay, so these guys are linked together, these two systems. Now, if we go in the remaining moments to what are the mechanisms or how does bone form, we see this word known as osteogenesis. Bone beginning. Bone beginning. So, ossification is a word that means the hardening or the development of bone or the beginning of bone. So, another name for it, also known as osteogenesis, bone beginning. We have two main types. We have intramembranous ossification, and then secondly we have endochondral. Intramembranous and endochondral. So let's talk about intramembranous first. The best example of intramembranous that we have is the development of the flat bones, like the bones that make up the skull. Okay? So the bones that make up the skull, this starts to take place in about week 8 of development. Okay? So week 8 of development is the answer on the exam for intramembranous. Did you get that?
Week 8 is the answer.
Week 8 is the answer on the exam to when does intramembranous ossification take place. So what's happening as we develop the flat bones of the skull? Okay, and they're uniquely different than the long bones like of the leg or the arm. So the flat bones of the skull, we're going to see some steps taking place. You've got a sandwich layer that's already beginning. If you can kind of appreciate, there's an outer layer here, and then there's an inner layer here. You have mesenchymal cells hovering around this outer tissue. In the middle, you start condensing the mesenchyme into a denser material. Again, it's going to form a flat bone. And you put new blood vessels, these are blood capillaries, inside the middle of it. As you put these new blood capillaries in here, these mesenchymal cells start to differentiate into osteoblasts. This is sort of step 1. You get ossification centers, where these osteoblasts can start laying down bone. And you can start to see the architecture of this trabeculae forming. So this shape right here is an early trabeculae forming. And you've got this mesenchymal sheet on either side. If you continue to move on in our development, same pictures, now we're just at this next stage, we start hollowing things out, right? We create this trabecular matrix. You're secreting soft matrix. You deposit calcium phosphate, which is the hard bony architecture. You maintain this diploid nature where you've got compact bone on either side, and you have the spongy bone or the trabeculated bone in the middle. And you can see these blood vessels have actually just further developed. They've actually gone within that matrix now, and they're moving throughout the spongy architecture. Yes?
Is it week 8 of pregnancy?
Week 8 of development of pregnancy. Yeah. You're going to get flat bones of the skull happening at week 8. Okay, that's pretty early on. You with me? So in this situation here, now we've got the osteoblasts differentiating into resident osteocytes because you actually have bone matrix that they can live in. So they have an architecture they can reside, and that's where they stay. And then lastly, step number 3 is you actually have this outermost surface completely calcified. So now you've got your diploid, you've got your compact bone, you have your spongy bone in the middle, and then compact bone down low. You started out that way as a scaffold or a template, and that's the way it ends up. In this last stage, you further form this periosteum on the outer surface and the endosteum on the inner lining. So this is how we form flat bones of the skull. Now, the flat bones of the skull aren't completely linked together and hardened at the time of birth. Right? We actually have these sutures that develop in between the cartilage. And they ossify later in life, shortly after birth. Why do you have these areas and these connection spots known as fontanels, otherwise called soft spots? Why would those exist in an embryo?
So for an easier birth through the
An
vaginal
easier
canal.
birth. Okay, what else? And for growth, to allow additional growth to take place. So if we look at these fontanels or these soft spots, we've got the frontal or the anterior. This one actually closes within 18 to 24 months of life. So the first 1.5 to 2 years of life, you have the frontal fontanelle, which is about right here on the top of the head. The others close within the first year. So the sphenoidal, the anterior, the mastoidal, and the occipital in the back, they all close within the first year of life. Questions over flat bone development, intramembranous. The frontal one is 18 to 24 months.
Should we be able to distinguish between the different stages of intramembranous ossification?
Yeah, I think it's important to be familiar with what's happening at the different stages. And the more important one is, can you contrast it with the second type of bone formation, endochondral. Okay? So endochondral, this actually forms a lot of the other bones of the body. Endochondral forms a lot of the other bones of the body, but the best examples that we talk about are long bones. So the long bones are formed in this way. You start out with a mesenchyme becoming cartilage, and it develops all the way at the end into this bony scaffold. And so the stages are uniquely different than intramembranous. This happens at week 6, so it's 2 weeks earlier. Right? The hyaline cartilage serves as the template for the ossification to take place. And these next slides are just these pictures actually blown up in higher magnification so you can see them. A lot of bones form this way, but the long bones are the best examples that we like to talk about. So step 1, you form this bony collar. You get this primary ossification center in the middle, and you invade it with a vascular supply. As you invade it with a vascular supply, you start hollowing it out, and this is what's going to form that medullary space. And you'll later be able to fill it full of cells and marrow cavity, marrow tissue. The osteoblasts that are in here differentiate into periosteum, and they form this bony collar, or this bony covering. That's step 1. And as you continue to move on to step 2, same picture, just different words. Now the chondrocytes, which are cartilage cells, they swell, they get bigger, they hypertrophy, enlarge. And as they do that, that signal, that enlargement is the signal for mineralization to take place, or for bone formation to take place. So as the bone forms, it cuts off the circulation to the cartilage cells, they die away, and it allows for the bone cells to grow in and take residence. The matrix deteriorates and serves as a splint, and this forms our primary marrow space. That's this picture right here. Now, in step 3, we get a periosteal bud. We're going to set up a secondary ossification center. And that's the other end of the epiphysis. Remember, we have the diaphysis in the middle, and then we have these epiphyseal ends at the proximal as well as the distal end. You guys remember that? And in between them, we're going to form this epiphyseal line. So as the cavity is invaded by blood vessels, you bring in all the cells that we studied. You bring in hematopoietic cells, nerve cells, osteoblasts, osteoclasts. They all enter into this new cavity. If we look at the last edge of what's happening with bone formation, we see the bone finishing off by our secondary ossification centers down here. Right? They hollow out a second cavity. You see the cavity here looks a lot like the cavity right here, but instead of primary, it's called secondary. And the same step happens at the secondary centers as what happened at the primary. At the last step, to get here, you form this epiphyseal plate, and that's where the growth takes place. I really hope you guys that are leaving right now understand there will be tough questions between this and intramembranous, and this is where most students miss a bulk of the questions on the next exam. Okay? So we'll review this material on Thursday. This is where we'll pick up, because I'm feeling like I'm losing you guys here. But let me just explain to you. We go the entire class period, so if you're going to get antsy, then maybe don't come. Okay? Because it gets really distracting. I'll see you Thursday.